Let me introduce our keynote speaker for today. He's Shakeel Tufail. He's the Federal Practice Director for HP Enterprise Security Solutions with over 22 years of computer industry-related experience. His tactical security experience ranges a wide spectrum that includes risk management, vulnerability assessments, trust and threat modeling, architectural risk analysis, systems and network architecture, penetration testing, application security testing, forensics investigation, incident response, DR, and BCP. So you can see he's a real security ninja. He has actually more than 20 security certificates. In today's talk, he's going to talk about why security modeling, software threat modeling is important, and then he's going to go into some specific technological details. He'll focus on best practices and a hands-on approach that provides a better understanding of how to conduct threat modeling in organizations. As most threat models focus on attackers, but he will look at the threat model using trust zones, identifying assets, indirect threats, and ambiguity analysis. So please join me in welcoming Shakeel on the floor.
Okay, so I'm going to start out with another brief introduction, but you might find it a little amusing. And so we'll start out with that, and then I'm going to talk about software security and why it's become more and more important over the past decade or even 2 decades in many cases. So currently I'm the Federal Practice Director for HP, running the federal practice for the Fortify, Web Inspect teams, and I work with ArcSight and Tipping Point. You might have heard of those brands. This is the second day of Hacktivity, so hopefully, and I'm glad that I'm starting a little bit later at 10:30, because usually the second day of a conference, people don't like to get up very early. So I hope everybody's had fun so far with the first day, and everyone is enjoying the conference. I certainly, first time here in Budapest and first time coming to Hacktivity. I've thoroughly enjoyed meeting people and enjoying all the different activities that Hacktivity has, and so this is fantastic. I definitely will be back. So, my name is Shakeel, and you may or may not have heard of a certain basketball star called Shaq. And you're welcome to call me Shaq with a K, but do not call me Shaq with a Q, because that's somebody else. So, born and raised in Washington, D.C., and again, practice director for HP, but before I joined HP, I was working with Fortify, and before Fortify, I worked for another software security company called Cigital. You may have heard of Dr. Gary McGraw. He's written a book on software security, and he was my boss. And before that, I worked for the Pentagon, for the Department of Defense, and ran the Security Operations Center for the Pentagon. I was the deputy program manager for about a year and a half. And then before that, I was working for General Dynamics, and before that, I was working for America Online as a developer. So I'm a former developer, guilty as charged, and so I learned a little bit about coding back then. These are some of the names that people have called me. I've deleted the names that I don't want people to call me up there. And again, these are some of the organizations that I've worked for. So that's just a quick intro. I'm also on the board of directors of Secure Ninja, a great organization that I'm proud to be part of. So let's get started with the actual presentation. I want to talk a little bit about software security and why software security has become so important over the past decade and more. One of the reasons is people do not know what software is. If, for example, you had a son or daughter or someone, who came up to you and said, Mom, Dad, Uncle, whoever, what is software? Can you explain what software is? How would you describe that? I've asked developers, I've asked technical and non-technical people, all kinds of different answers, sometimes very hard to explain. But you see, software is a process, right? It's not just a single product or entity. And you've probably heard of the software development lifecycle. And so there's different parts of the process to create a good software product. Part of that being quality, part of that obviously should be security as well. So software has product documentation, requirements, design. That's the beginning of building a software product. Then you have the code, the API, the plugins, the framework, all of the different pieces that you have to code or create in order to have a viable software product. And then finally, you can't just put the code on a server and let it, make it run. You're going to have runtime. You have to compile the code, and then it connects to possibly a more complex system, and now you have a software running in production. Okay? So when we're talking about securing software, it's not just doing a penetration test at the end of the life cycle, which is absolutely necessary, but honestly, it's the worst time to do security. Once you've already built the product, you've already implemented your design, and now you think about security as an afterthought, right? And unfortunately, I've worked both commercial and government clients, and they still do not have that embedded security process that should be there. Software in today's world is so important. It covers so many facets of our data and day-to-day living and mission critical systems. We're looking at data, time, money, reputation, legal and compliance, and if it's federal government or military, then you're also looking at a lot of Intel mission critical systems, SCADA systems that are running our infrastructures today. And the problem is that a lot of that is money, right? We're always looking at loss of money or loss of trust, but in today's world, software is so critical that it also costs lives if we don't secure it or protect it from intrusion. And we'll see this more and more prevalent as we go forward. So there's a study that Verizon came out with. They've come out with it for the last 5 or 6 years, and I've been tracking it. It's been very interesting. You can see that last year was a terrible year of hacks and hacktivism, and most of the attacks were on the software layer. And if you take a look at the cost is going up exponentially. In fact, $214 a record by many organizations, including Gartner reports that I've read, is conservative, right? And so I'm actually going to show you a little case study. You're probably familiar with the Sony hack that occurred last year, and so we'll talk about that. The other problem is that, back when I started out in IT, hacking was a fairly good term. It meant someone who was creative, someone who was looking for features and functionality that wasn't part of the system, and they were looking for unique ways of possibly even making the product better, right? And there were, the bad hackers that were, taking systems down or infiltrating, government and corporate IP, and that's obviously malicious, but those were single entities, usually someone who wanted to prove themselves, or very rarely did you see an organized attack. But in today's climate, you can see that 92% of the external agents that were attacking our systems in the past few years have been through organized crime. So you've heard of Anonymous and LulzSec and many other organizations out there, and these are loosely organized in many cases. Sometimes they're very organized. If it's another state or country, it's a very organized methodology of hacking or attack or exploitation. And 17% were implicated insiders, of which, surprisingly, 11% were executives, but 70% of them were non-technical. So attacks today, like a lot of people say, well, you've got to be a coder, programmer, you have to be someone with a lot of technical expertise, but you don't. Today, whether it's, scripts and tools that you get off the internet, or just having more knowledge than we did a decade ago, 10, 15, 20 years ago, children were not taught, information technology in schools. Today, you start in the elementary level, in the high school level, you start looking at and learning about IT systems. So right off the bat, the next generation is smarter and more in tune with today's technology. The other problem is 96% of these breaches, 96%, were completely avoidable. You could absolutely have prevented the attack if you had put in simple controls, some simple review, whether it's code review or the design and architecture or a threat model, you could have eliminated and found these software vulnerabilities, right? And that's really very, very sad. In today's world, in 2012, we still have attacks for controls that we have implemented and prevented for years. The other problem is 76% of all the data was compromised from servers. So someone just asked me at the conference the other day, where should we implement security? And I absolutely believe that client-side security is important. But think about this: your web browser, your laptop, your iPhone or Android or whatever device you have can absolutely be compromised because it's not in your control, right? So you can put antivirus on there. You can put a software firewall or other products and tools and implement security on the client side, but it can always be subverted. You can reverse engineer software, you can subvert the browser, and there's all kinds of free tools and so forth on the client. So what can you control? As an organization, whether commercial, government, nonprofit, you can control your servers and the code on your servers, your application servers, and you can also secure your database and your infrastructure. So I'm not saying don't spend time on the client, right? But the client will be subverted. It will be maliciously maligned to create exploits and attacks against your system. We should be focusing on our software, on our infrastructure, on our architecture and system and how it communicates with these clients, right? People have this big thing now. Every year there's something new, right? A couple of years ago it was APT, then it was mobile devices, and then it's cloud and so forth. These things are just renamed things. It's probably controversial that I'm saying this, but they've been around forever. The main basics of security is still the same, right? So what are some software security vulnerabilities, right? SQL injection, command injection, cross-site scripting. These are from any top 10 software security list. These come from OWASP top 10 and the CWE SANS top 25 most dangerous software errors, right? These are, software vulnerabilities that in most cases can be avoided, yet they still are on the top 10. In fact, I'm shocked, and I'll talk a little bit about SQL injection. SQL has been around for at least 2 decades, and SQL injection is completely avoidable. Completely avoidable, right? And you probably can't read that way in the back, but here's a tweet by Lulsec. It says, "Why would we need to waste time with more complex hacks when sites like Sony and InfraGard get owned via simple hacks? You're dumb." So they're almost taunting us, saying that, we don't have to do complex attacks. We don't have to create advanced APT type attacks. Simple SQL injection will get us into your system, right? So whatever organization you work with, whether you're independent or with an organization, please tell them, just eliminate SQL injection and I'll be happy. If we just eliminate SQL injection, I think we can solve a lot of this problem. And here's an example of SQL injection, and you've probably seen the standard 1 = 1. There's absolutely more advanced attacks. But look at this list. Heartland Payment Systems, you know about that attack? 130 million credit cards stolen. 130 million credit cards stolen by a SQL injection. Sony, Lisa Moon, PBS, MySQL, the list goes on. Even the US Senate was compromised by a SQL injection attack, right? Absolutely unnecessary. What can a SQL injection do? Here's a list. It's devastating. Schema discovery, you can do data extraction, you can do brute forcing, and you can guess usernames, etc. And in fact, some commands, like on SQL Server, XP_command shell, you know what that does? Gives you root level access to the server. On Oracle, you can use command_exec, right? Now these should be turned off, right? A lot of people say, oh, well, the patch actually doesn't allow XP_command shell. But then my team goes out, does an audit, and XP_command shell is working, right? And then we tell them, do not give root level privilege to the application, to the database. And they said, but why? We trust the database. And I said, well, how about if somebody has done, you heard of a stored cross-site scripting attack? This is where you put in a scripting attack in a form or some type of client that posts to the server, and now it's stored in the table. And when that form is brought up by whoever, especially somebody with privilege, that script will run. And it will attack your application from the inside, right? So it's a new paradigm, because now I tell developers, you can't trust your database. I said, I can't trust my own database? I created the database. I said, but do you filter the input going into your database? Do you know what's stored in your database? How about if your database attacks your application because somebody stored a script there, because they filled out a registration form or some type of client-side attack that posted something that the server did not validate, right? So it's a new way of thinking. And this is how you protect against SQL injection. You have input sanitation, parameterized queries, right? In Java, you can create prepared statements, and you can use object relational mapping libraries. You've probably heard of Hibernate and Ibatis, right? These are already out there. They've been out there for years. And if you implement these controls, you can prevent SQL injection. It's solved. We don't have to try to fix it. We already know how to fix it. But yet, we still get attacked with SQL injection. Let's talk about the Sony hack. Hopefully nobody's from Sony here. They're probably going to hate me. But it's in the news. It's in the web. You've probably heard about it. If you play Sony PlayStation, you were probably affected by it. It was a little bit of SQL injection, but a lot of pain from that injection. So here's how it happened. First of all, Sony was not aware of how their software interacted with all their different commercial entities. You have Sony PlayStation Network, you have Sony Music Online, you have Sony Movies, Sony Online Pictures, you have all kinds of different Sony websites for different countries, and they're all connected. So the attackers found a little-known web application server. It wasn't the front door, right? What does a good thief do? A good thief doesn't walk through the front door, doesn't break your window and crawl in. A good thief is going to find a back door or a roof or basement or something that is less secure or has less security mechanisms, and they're going to come in and attack your system or steal something from your home or office. So they went in and they put in a communications tool, right? A two-way communications tool to that server. And what good thieves do is good thieves, they make sure that they understand what your infrastructure looks like. They do reconnaissance. They do footprinting of your network to see what operating systems, what patches you have, how the servers are connected to each other, and then they create the attack, right? A dumb thief is going to just try to break down the door and will be caught, right? A good thief is going to be able to save or eliminate their tracks and delete the logs and prevent forensics and incident response, or at least delay it. In any case, people say, well, we have firewalls, we have network IPS, IDS systems, intrusion prevention systems, intrusion detection systems, all kinds of different controls and routers, that are, very strict in their access control and so forth. But Sony had a web application firewall, yet the attacker still got in past that web application firewall, because it's only as good as the rules that you have set, right? And everybody knows the default rules are good, but attackers that are smart are not going to, use traditional attacks. They're going to find ways to get around those rules. And so once they got in and set up their beachhead, and now they're looking at the different parts of the network, then what they did was they started to create privileged accounts. And so these were, privilege escalation, where they had a standard user and they upgraded it to a root or admin privilege, and they got root privileges on multiple servers, which allowed them to get to the transaction server, which was connected to 77 million records in the Sony PlayStation Network database, right? Names, addresses, credit card numbers, all kinds of PII. You know what PII is? Personally identifiable information, okay? And then, from there, they wanted to download these records, but they knew that if they started to download these records, then someone is going to wake up and say, what's going on? So, in this case, organized crime. they got Anonymous to do a denial of service, a DDoS, against the Sony PlayStation Network. And basically the website was being attacked at, billions of packets a second. And so all the network folks, all the security folks are focused on that DDoS, right? It's not something new. It's a diversionary tactic, right? Look over there while I do something over here. And so basically, at that point, they started to download all the records while the DDoS was occurring, okay? Now, Sony at this point still did not know, and this is not just Sony. This is many organizations that are like this. At this point, they still did not know that they had been breached, that there was an attack going on. They just knew about the DDoS, and they were looking at that. Now, if you're a good thief, again, what do? You cover your tracks. You make sure that you are not caught, right? You don't want to be caught if you're doing something bad, right? So what is the first thing that anybody does when there's an attack or some type of troubleshooting or problem in the network or in the software? You look at the logs, right? You debug the logs. You look at the different control lists that you have on the firewalls to see, which IPs, which ports, who came in at what time, what they did, and how long they were there. So these attackers knew that they had to delete all these logs. So when you have a log in memory, sometimes you are not able to delete that because it's an active state. So what do you have to do? You have to either close the logs or close the application, or you have to reboot the server and then delete the logs before the application starts. So they created cron scripts, right? For those of you who know Unix, Linux, cron scripts are basically Unix scripts that allow you to run some commands. And so they put cron scripts on all the servers, and then they initiated the reboot of hundreds, maybe thousands of servers that were running the applications that Sony uses. And when they restarted, the logs were deleted, okay? Now, at this point, finally, someone gets a call. I think it was 4 p.m. back in April of last year. And they said, hey, all the servers are rebooting. I think we have some electrical problem or something's happening. What's happening? And then they started looking at it, and they started looking at the logs, and they were able to find some information, and they finally found they had a breach. At first, I can go into a lot of details because I looked at the entire case study of Sony. They denied it, saying, oh, well, there might have been something, but nobody's data was stolen. We don't have any evidence. It took them weeks before they admitted the attack. And that's the problem with security, right? Most people don't want to say, hey, we got attacked, sorry, but, won't happen again, I hope, And so most organizations are not forthcoming with vulnerabilities or exploits or breaches against their system. And Sony was very reluctant for obvious reasons in the beginning. Here's the problem. Because the attackers were good thieves, they already knew what the system looked like, what the network looked like, what the software architecture looked like, what the data flow in that software system looked like. And so they were able to, while they were trying to figure out and fix this main attack, they were able to attack other parts of the network. They attacked Sony Music. They attacked Sony Pictures, movies, right? They attacked other Sony websites all across the world. I think Sony Portugal was one, and Sony Brazil, and others. Does anybody know how many attacks occurred before Sony got a control around it and stopped the attacks from occurring? Any idea? How many people think it was 5 attacks? 10? 15? 21 attacks. 21 breaches before Sony said, we give up, please, stop, right? And so 24.6 million records were stolen from another database. In the reaction, they didn't know what was going on. They shut down the PlayStation Network. Now imagine, any company shutting down their website or their infrastructure for even 1 hour, 1 day. They shut it down for 1 month. You couldn't connect to the PlayStation Network while they were doing the investigation because they had no idea what happened, how big it was, and they had to make sure they got it under control, right? So millions of dollars lost every day, and people probably switching to other companies, I wasn't able to, well, I don't play PlayStation that much, but sometimes, but my kids, let's say, were playing PlayStation. And so they couldn't play, so they were playing Xbox and Nintendo and other games. All that was lost. Now, here's the really bad part of it. 20 plus, actually this should be updated, 21 breach incidents, 177 million credit cards stolen, 171 million spent last year on investigation. Their stock has dropped 33%. Lost customers, bad reputation. They didn't have a CISO, so they hired a CISO. Like, that's going to help, right? The total impact to Sony, $24 billion is what Gartner and Forrester and other companies that are researching this are looking at. $24 billion, right? Now, let me ask you a question. Well, let me talk very quickly on how the impact could have been minimized. Weak or default passwords on their system. I mean, that is a no-brainer. Anybody who has that deserves to be, well, I'm not going to say deserves to be hacked, but will be hacked, right? Poorly configured databases, right? They had no idea where the sensitive data was. This is why software threat modeling is so important, because most people just write the software, plug it into the system, add new features, put it into their network, servers, and hope everything is going to work well, right? They also had no controls around the sensitive data. Local database logging was easily compromised and erased because they ran cron jobs and deleted all the logs. And then the blocking at the database was the last line of defense, right? When it should have been at the application server, at the code level, okay? So $24 billion, millions of dollars already spent. What do you think the preventative cost would have been if they had eliminated just SQL injection? There were other attacks like the malware communication tool and the privilege escalation and the brute force and other attacks. But if they had just eliminated SQL injection, which was the way that they downloaded all the data from the database, how much would it have cost? Well, I'm sorry? Anybody have a clue? Well, I can tell you what HP, in my job currently, if somebody said come in and do a scan and do an audit and so forth, I would charge them $10,000. 7,700 euros. And we could fix the SQL injection. Yet, millions of dollars were lost because the SQL injection wasn't found and corrected, right? So, I want to talk a little bit about the lessons learned from not only the Sony attack. I could do the same case study on TJ Maxx, right? That was a SQL injection. Heartland Payment Systems, Liza Moon, all these different attacks. If you go to, there's a couple of good websites out there, privacyrights.org, datalostdb.org. These are kind of independent nonprofit organizations, and they track breaches, and you see SQL injection all over the place, cross-site scripting and buffer overflows and privilege escalation everywhere, okay? But why has this become so much more important? I was just thinking about this because I travel and fly all the time, and I usually fly on United Airlines. And back about 10, 15 years ago, right, you couldn't even book a reservation online for, a flight. Now, honestly speaking, if you call United Airlines, at least in the US, and you say, can you help me book a reservation? They say, well, we recommend that you do it online. And I said, well, can't you help me? I can, but I'm going to have to charge you like a $25 fee. I said, really? Where's customer service? They're pushing people to the web. And so think about this. If you go to United Airlines or whatever airline you fly, right, most websites for airlines are pretty advanced. You can book your flight. You can change your reservation. You can change your seats or get the seats that you want. You can cancel flights. You can upgrade your seats, all kinds of different things you can do. You can do flight status, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now imagine, God forbid, it better not happen before I fly out, but if United Airlines website went down, even for 1 hour, how many millions of dollars would that cost them, right? Because they've put all their company's IP and their entire business model is around their website. And that's not just United. Think about any large organization, whether it's commercial or government, the software is running the company, right? Can we go back to the old days? No way, right? you are, dependent upon your software and your applications. But the problem was, back when I started, dating myself a little bit, back when I started it was less than 56K modems, probably 14.4K modems, and I was in college before Windows 95 came out, so it was basically DOS and Unix. And there wasn't a lot of software systems that were advanced enough to run companies. Today, your entire company is run by software, right? You're completely dependent upon it. And so we're going to talk about these 4 things real quick. I want to make sure I keep a track on time. Connectivity. In the past 10, 15, 20, 30 years and longer since the internet was invented and has been around, this is from internetworldstats.com. There's close to 7 billion people. This is the end of December 31st, so it's probably over 7 billion people in the world today, and there's 2.3 billion people on the internet. That means if you have a web application on the internet, that means that 2.3 billion people can connect to your website, right? And we know that not all of them are good, upstanding citizens and do the right things. And that's only 32% of the world. I think in the next 10 years, 20 years, it's probably going to be closer to 50% or more of all the users. Maybe small children and very elderly folks may not be on the internet as much, but this is growing, and we can see it's growing. In North America, which is Canada, US, and Mexico, we have a 78% penetration rate of number of people on the web, still growing at 152%. But look at some other parts of the world. Look at Europe is at 500 million users. That's almost double, North America. Asia is at 1 billion, and that's only 26% of all of Asia, and they're still growing at 789%. You've got Africa, and you've got Middle East growing at 2,000, close to 3,000% per year. So we're going to be more dependent on software. We're going to have more people looking at our websites, at our software applications, at our mobile devices. It's not going to go down. So we have to accept the fact that we are going to have, to implement more security mechanisms. We also have folks, and since I work a lot with our federal government and intelligence agencies, they say, well, our network is not on the internet. It's siloed or air-gapped is what they say. And large companies, they say, well, our internal network is not connected to anybody else, right? But even these classified systems have millions of people on them, right? All it takes is one bad actor to attack your site. So that is a fallacy. In fact, here's a very good example. You've heard of the space station, which is not even on Earth. It's outside of this world, in space, 10 miles out of space. And I saw this article, and it says, oh, we found some malware. The W32 Gemima worm was found on the space station. Now, the space station has no internet. It's only a direct link. I think maybe US and Russia have connections through satellite uplink to the space station. And it's encrypted, and it's very secure. Yet they got this worm. And if you are familiar with this worm, if anybody plays World of Warcraft or some of the other online games, this is an online gaming virus which steals credentials. How did it get on the space station? Was an astronaut playing World of Warcraft and didn't tell us? I don't know. But the problem is that the NASA, this is a space agency for people that don't know. Kelly Humphrey said, it's not a frequent occurrence, but this isn't the first time. So if they can get malware in space, then I don't care how closed your system is and you've got security guards blocking access to your server rooms and you've got all kinds of controls on your software and network, you will still be compromised. It just takes one time. So I don't want to hear about, oh, we're not on the internet, so we should be safer. You might be a little bit safer, but not much. And software has become more complex. So how many developers do we have in the room? Okay, quite a few, right? By the way, in my humble opinion, right? If you want to be a really good hacker or security guy, learn how to program. Even just some Python and some simple scripts and Perl and so forth, right? Those are the ones that are really strong at hacking instead of just using tools. But open source is fantastic. The problem is that, and this is a question not only to the developers, to everybody, have you ever been part of a project where the software that you were writing or creating decreased in size? Did you ever say, hey, you know what, the new version of iPhone is coming out, we've just decreased the number of features just for you to make sure that it's more smaller and nimble and faster? No. Everybody wants more. When is the new feature going to come out? We need this functionality. Can we connect this to the bigger system? And your code gets bigger and bigger and bigger. You just look at Windows, right? When it came out in the mid-90s, Windows 3, 3.1 was probably about 2 million lines of code. Windows 8, which is coming out this month, is 70 million lines of code. 70 million lines of code. So software does not decrease. There might be some times where you separated the software or cleaned it up and it went down, but that's temporary. It will always keep getting bigger. So now you take a look at software. I was surprised that in 1981 Cadillac, there was 500,000 lines of code. I was shocked. But in today's S-Class Mercedes or premium car, 20 to 100 million lines of code. You have GPS, you have touch systems, you have all kinds of Bluetooth, you have all kinds of music controls, all run by software, right? Can you believe a car having 100 million lines of code? Unbelievable. That's more than Windows. Security vulnerabilities average 10% of the code. So if you have 100,000 lines of code, 10% of that, 10,000 lines of code are vulnerable to attack. In my business, because I actually have real data, I see it at 15 to 18%. 15 to 18% of the code is vulnerable to attack. That's unbelievable. And then here's something that I want to start talking about. And I'm going to speed up a little bit, but I'm here all day, and I'll probably be at the HP booth or somewhere around here. If you have any further questions, please let me know, and I'll give the slides to Hacktivity so you can download them. I do a full-day course on threat modeling, but unfortunately, I have 50 minutes. We start out with asking developers what their software looks like. I don't do a network infrastructure or architecture, diagram. I look at the software. Where's your web servers, your app servers? How do they communicate? What other systems are connected to them? So we start out with something on a whiteboard. We start creating a software component model. And usually the first diagram is pretty simple. This is a 3-tiered web application, right? You have a web server, you have the application server, and then you have the database. And so we look at just the simple controls here, but then we start looking at what's connected to this application. How does it communicate with other parts of your company's software or infrastructure? And then we see all of these external connections. And you can't read this, but it says out of scope and in scope. So this is in scope, this is out of scope, right? You've heard that term? One time I was doing a presentation, and this senior manager, right? I won't say his name or company, says, listen, please don't waste our time. Only tell me you did an audit on our application. Just tell me about this. Don't tell me about all these out-of-scope connections. And I said, do you think a hacker would have an in-scope or out-of-scope? I mean, would a hacker say, hey, you know what, let's just focus on this application because that's out of scope. Don't touch the other part of this software, please. I said, I'm not going to do a deep dive into this. I won't go into detail, but I want you to know what is connected here. Now, this is from a real audit that I did. And this was probably, obviously I can't give you the name, in the top 5 financial organizations in the world. And this is stock and banking and mutual funds and retirement accounts, investment and so forth, all in this organization being run. This is one of the applications where it's being run, and then these are all the supporting applications. And they were doing an update. They were going from classic ASP, God forbid, to .NET, And so they wanted a full review on it. And after we did the entire inspection, only 6 to 8 weeks, I think it was 8 weeks total, this is what their software looked like. They thought their software looked like that. When we showed them this is your software, they said, well, what's all this stuff? I said, well, this is your application. This is still the web server, application server. This is your database. This is your backup database. This is some network attached storage and logs and other connections. All this stuff in gray is out of scope, but this is connecting to the database with credit cards, with banking information, investment information, personal information, even all kinds of records and background and criminal history, because all investment advisors and stockbrokers in the US have to go through testing and a background check. All of that was in the database. And I said, this is your front door, but these are all the connections that you may or may not control that are connecting to the database. If I was an attacker and I wanted to get this data, I don't care if I come from here, 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 or here, right? I'll talk more about this in a second. Then we have extensibility. Third-party utilities, open source software, more and more, back in the old days, you picked a language, C, C++, you created an application, you put it out there, you're good to go. Today, we have the .NET framework, the J2EE frameworks, PHP, other open source utilities, hundreds of languages out there. And when you create an application for .NET or Java, you're creating it on top of a framework that's millions of lines of code. Java has probably 2 or 3 million lines of code as well as .NET. So even if you create a 100-line small hello world application or whatever you create, it's running on top of millions of lines of code. These have vulnerabilities. They're patched all the time. There's a reason why there's a service pack 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, right? They're constantly patched, right? PHP vulnerabilities all over the place, even Java. There was a recent Java exploit that gave you root access, So we have very complex software today. We have all kinds of code, not just our own, other code from other organizations that we depend on that's connected to our software. And so our software is very complex, it's constantly changing, and so the security controls around it has to be part of a process. Compliance and standards. Now, I haven't researched all the compliance in Europe and other parts of the world, but here's a small list of compliance that we have in the United States. You probably obviously have PCI and credit card compliance issues, but here are some, federal compliance. NERC, this is SCADA, right? This is our National Electrical Reliability Corporation, and this looks at our utilities like electric, gas, water, et cetera, Homeland Security, Federal Information Systems, HIPAA for healthcare, Financial Act, Sarbanes-Oxley, you probably heard of SOX, and so forth, especially if you're working for a multinational company, they have to be compliant. And more of these controls require software security, right? And you get fined if you don't pass them. Let's talk about software threat modeling. I've got about 10 minutes left. I'll probably go a little bit over, and if you have any questions, I'll take 1 or 2. But please see me if you have further questions around this. I want to give you a high-level idea of how to do a software threat model, and hopefully you can find other ways to get more information through the web. One of the things that we also have a problem with is definitions. People don't know the difference. You guys probably do, but most people don't know the difference between what's a vulnerability, what's an exploit, what do these terms mean? What is an attack? Is an attack the same thing as an exploit? Well, a threat is an agent or entity, right? It's usually 99% of the time human, but sometimes it could be a bot or an automated script. It was originally created by a human, but now it's running on its own. A vulnerability is a weakness or flaw in the system. An exploit is the attack on the system, and the compromise is a successful attack. So let's take a look at something everybody would probably understand very easily. If you were trying to guard this building or house, you have security mechanisms like lock. You have threats that want to break in and steal something valuable. You have vulnerabilities like breaking a doorknob, using an exploit like a hammer. And the compromise is stealing money, jewelry, TV, electronics, whatever they want that's valuable to them. And the definitions you see here are exactly the same in software, right? In software, you should have security mechanisms, not just on the front layer, but on all the multiple layers in between your front door and your database or whatever valuable entity you're trying to protect. Like, if you really want to protect a building or your home, you're not going to have just one lock. You might have 2, 3 locks. You'll make sure that the back door is locked and the windows are locked. You're also going to have cameras inside. You maybe have motion detectors. and maybe even a dog, or some security guard if it's a building to protect. But in software, we have firewalls, we have intrusion detection systems, we have all kinds of network appliances, and then the software is like, oh, you're in, come on in, you're already in. Once you pass those controls, there's no other further controls on the software or on the application server. So that's why it's very important to do a threat model to see what your software looks like. Here are the basics. And again, you'll have these slides, so you can look at this in more detail or have more time to look at it. You first have to identify your assets. Security is an adjective. You can secure anything. We can secure this room, you can secure a person, you can secure your car, you can secure your network, you can secure your software. But the first thing you want to define is what are we trying to protect, right? Is there data that we are trying to protect, or is there a mechanism or some type of functional requirement that we're trying to protect? You have to identify what you're going to protect. If you don't know what you're protecting, then how are you going to create security for it? So you have to identify the assets. Then you do a software architecture overview. Component diagrams, like I showed you. Data flow is very interesting because we don't know where our data is. Sony didn't know where their data was. They knew that they had some data on the database, but they didn't know how many databases they had and how they were connected. But more importantly, people don't look at data flow. Once somebody gets in, where's the code sending that person, right? Where's the data in transit? Not just the data at rest. And then you have to decompose the software, creating use cases and abuse cases. You look for areas in this architecture diagram, such as trust boundaries and so forth, and then you decompose it to find weaknesses. And once you identify the weaknesses, you have to identify threats. Who has access to that area, or who can potentially have access? Something that you should definitely look at is Microsoft has a threat modeling component in their SDL, their software development lifecycle, and it's called Stride and Dread, right? It's not perfect, but it's definitely a good start. And so you can start identifying threats. I'll show you a slide in a second about it, and then create a remediation plan, right? The other problem with security is that we scan, test, and then we say, oh, look at all the stuff we found. But then we say, oh, who's going to fix it? Oh, I don't know, I'm just a security guy, I'm not going to fix it. What are you talking about? Tell the developers to fix it, or tell the network guys to, put up more devices, more firewalls, and so forth. So you have to have a remediation plan, because why did you find all the problems, and that's why a lot of people don't want to find the problems, right? They're like, don't tell me, I don't want to know. So software is complex, right? You have to look at it. Remember the first question I asked? Software is documents, requirements, it has source code, all kinds of third-party and open source software embedded with it, and you have runtime. So you have to view the software in design mode, in the actual construction mode for coding, in the runtime, and you have to do security checks in all of these different assessment views. Once you do that, there's 3 ways you do it. Discovery, first is to inspect and analyze. You do interviews with developers, with quality assurance, or program managers, technical managers. You understand what the software looks like, what it really looks like, not what it looked like 5 years ago, but what it looks like today. And then you do an analysis to verify that the security mechanisms still work, or that there are security mechanisms, and then you do substantiation by demonstrating that there is a security problem, right? Once you do that, these are a number of different techniques that I use. One is a high-level architecture diagram, which you saw. Then I create a data flow diagram. Where's the data going, right? You can see that in the code. You can see that in a live production environment. You can see where the data is going, but nobody really takes the time to look at it. And it's changing all the time. So you don't do it once a year. Every single time you change code or something else is added to the system, do a quick check. Have I introduced a weakness or vulnerability? And then you do ambiguity analysis, which is something very unique, which I just found through experience. And here's the quick example. If I have, let's say, an application with 15 developers, if I call, let's say, 5 of their top developers into a room, with their boss or a senior developer, and I say, okay, tell me about your software. Let's draw it out. what does it look like, what are the components, what are the languages, and we start learning about it, right? There might be some folks that will add to the conversation, but usually everybody will look at the senior developer and one person will talk, right? And then if there's a manager in the room, nobody else will talk, the manager will talk, right? So what do? I say I want to interview every developer, every QA, every tech manager, network infrastructure person, whoever it is, individually. And so when I talk to 5 developers, I have them draw the same thing. Do you think every picture is the same? No, not at all. That's ambiguity analysis. So when I talk to a developer, what do you think the authentication mechanism looks like on your software? Well, it looks like this, this, and this. Then I go to a second developer. How does the authentication mechanism work? Well, I think it works this way, but I don't work on that team. I'm working on a different module, right? And that's the problem. As a developer and being a former developer, I was given some requirements and I was given, work on this, release this. It's a huge application. I don't know the other parts. I'm hoping that they're doing their job and that somebody's looking at security because it wasn't me. And that when it all connects together, everything will be nice and happy and everything will work. And if I get some bugs, I'll fix my bugs, but if I see a bug that somebody else is working on, that's not my bug. I assign it to the other developer. Right? You know what I'm talking about. So the problem is when I get those 5 developers and I say, well, if 5 people have different ideas of how authentication works, that means that we have a security problem because nobody knows how the authentication is really working. That's just one example. So that's ambiguity analysis. Find invalid assumptions that people might have. Sequence diagrams, create abuse and misuse cases, and then create attack trees, to find potential exploits, look for areas, and maybe even patches or open vulnerabilities that might be in the system. And then from there, and this is, I already talked about this, interviews, artifacts, look at the diagrams, provide feedback. Now another thing is, a lot of people come in and they want to do an audit, and I'm very different. When people do an audit, they say, okay, don't bother us, don't talk to us, we're security, we're going to do an audit for 2 weeks, or an IV&V, an independent validation and verification, and we'll give you the report. Right? But I don't believe in that. When I create a diagram, I'm listening to them, I'm writing it down, I go back and I tell the developers, hey, let's get in a room. Am I correct? Is this what it looks like? Yeah, everything's fine. No, wait, that doesn't connect to this database, it connects to this database, and that connects here. And I say, oh, let me fix that. And I keep talking to them almost daily. By the end, two or three things are very good about that. One, at the end when I do the presentation, everybody already knows what my diagram looks like. So nobody's going to say, nope, you're wrong. You don't know what you're doing. That's a wrong diagram, or that's a wrong, assumption. If I talk to them every day, even though I'm a security guy, one, they become on my side, and we're working together, right? And at the end, everybody agrees with me. That's a nice thing, right? Most times security guy's coming, They don't want to even talk to you. So at the end, they all say, yeah, you're right, you're absolutely, we have to fix these things. It's very nice to have a good meeting at the end of an audit. And then the other thing is, I'm not making a mistake or making a wrong assumption. I mean, that's the biggest part, right? I don't want to do an audit in IV&V and at the end they said, oh, you just wasted 2 weeks of my time and you don't even have a report that I agree with, right? So it's very important to provide that feedback. And then attack-oriented analysis. You can look at STRIDE for that. Asset-oriented, again, you have to find out what the assets are, identify the security goals, worst-case scenarios, misuse cases, and illities. You know what the illities are? In most cases, software or any product has functional requirements. When I press this button, it shall do this. Or when I run this script, the system will do this or shall do this. And so when you have functional requirements, they're easy to test and so forth. But then you have, in security, non-functional requirements, such as reliability, scalability, availability, right, dependability. These are non-functional requirements. For instance, will the system run on Windows XP? Will it run on Windows 8? That's a non-functional requirement. Will the system run with a minimum bandwidth of 10 megabits per second? Or do I need 100 megabits per second? That's non-functional. You can call it stress testing as well. And there's other areas that you have to look at that are non-functional, that are security concerns. Because lack of availability is a major security concern as well as a quality concern. And then you have to do defense-oriented analysis. If someone is going to get in and attack you, it's inevitable that people are trying, and they may get in. Once they're in, do you have other security mechanisms that will help lower the attack or prevent the attack altogether? And then finally, substantiation. You take those findings and you prioritize them. Just like quality bugs and defects, not every defect has to be fixed, right? You look at the critical defects, the things that have to be fixed before production. There might be some cosmetic flaws or features you want to add later. And you say, okay, we'll do those in the next release. Honestly, you can do that with security as well, right? There may be things that you have low risk on, or risks that are not very damaging, and you have to make those decisions sometimes. There's a balance between security and usability, and you have time and money and release dates. And so it's not a matter of, hey, I found 1,000 things, you better fix this in 2 weeks, otherwise you're not going to go to production. I don't believe in that, because that's how security gets a bad name. You have to go in and prioritize and understand what your threat model is, and then you make the decisions. Oh, sorry. Recommendations. You create a remediation plan. I don't just say, hey, here's the report, here's a scan, good luck, I'm out of here. You have to tell them, here's how you fix it, right? And if your organization has consultants, or if the company is willing to help you remediate, and you have the budget, help them remediate it. Why wait? Or try to figure it out yourself? The whole point was, let's find the problems, and then let's fix them. Here's the original data flow diagram that I gave you. I want to show you a couple of quick things. I could probably spend a whole hour and talk about this alone, and you probably can't see the different protocols I have here in the legend, but you can see the colors. The yellow is SQLnet. So this was an Oracle database, and SQLnet is a protocol used to do database access between different applications and the Oracle database. HTTPS is the light blue. That obviously is encrypted with SSL, and very common. FTP, is FTP encrypted by default? Is it secure by default? No, right? FTP is purple. So that's kind of the purple. Maybe it's not coming out on this screen, but that's purple, and that's purple too. So that's FTP. Then SOAP. Anybody know SOAP? Service-oriented architecture protocol, web services, right? Web services usually don't even have authentication mechanisms, and in 90% of the cases, they don't have any encryption. And SOAP calls are web services in red, so there's some web services. And then HTTP is just your standard HTTP, no encryption, no protection there, except just connectivity between HTML web pages and the client. And the thing here is, just looking at that legend, just by putting this diagram together, how many of those protocols were encrypted or secure, communicated? Just the light blue. So once you connect in and you're inside the website or past that first security mechanism, the rest of the organization and all the third-party out-of-scope applications and FTP servers connecting to other sites not in your control, all unencrypted. And I'm not saying that everything has to be encrypted, but you have to have security mechanisms or some type of filtering to understand what's coming in and what's going out, because it's coming in to the most important asset of your company. And if you look at this FTP, I'll give you one quick example, and I've got a few slides and I'm going to finish up. This was a financial organization, so they got stock information from different organizations like New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, American Stock Exchange, etc. And these were stock feeds coming in. So they said, but why do we need to filter those? That's just ASCII, it's just, text, it's what's the security problem with that? And I said, well, how about if somebody was malicious and they sent the data feed with maybe some scripts, some session ID hacking, cross-site scripting, scripts that they, again, could bring in through this FTP connection and store it in your database. That's a stored cross-site scripting attack. Do you do any type of filtering here before you store it in your database? Oh, no, we don't. I said, oh, okay. Well, you may want to think about that. So again, I could talk all day about this, but this is so important. to look at our software from a holistic overview to understand what it looks like. And then you can do threat motivations and trust zones. And so, this is an unauthorized black hat malicious person trying to hack in. This is an authorized user, which could also be malicious, but at least they have credentials to get in. This is, in green, an admin or an employee of the company that has access. This is a third-party person or maybe an employee that doesn't have access to the database or to the application, and they have connectivity and access. So some of the things that we do is we look at what is inside the actual architecture and who has access to those areas, okay? Here's a couple of things, and again, you'll have the slides. If you want to try this, here's some basic questions. Find an application in your organization, do a high-level architecture diagram, identify the assets, the trust zones, maybe attacker roles, and the threats around that, and document that. Then the next thing is, these are the questions I want you to ask. Which assets are most valuable? Where are the design flaws? Where's data in transit? Where's data at rest? Worst case scenario, and what are some of the recommendations that you would give as a security person or even a non-security person to the organization to fix those things? So, very simple exercise, but I think you'll find it very enlightening. Last thing I want to leave you with is, and I checked, there's an OWASP chapter. How many people know of OWASP? Open Web Application Security Project. Well, your last meeting was in 2009, folks. So someone should go there. It's a voluntary, nonprofit organization. Get together and meet sometimes, whether it's in Budapest or some other city in Hungary or even outside of Hungary if you want. And go to opensam.org. I've been working on this project with a whole team of folks that are much, much smarter than me. And it's a fantastic software assurance methodology of how to build security into your software. It starts with governance, construction, verification, deployment. And this is what it looks like. These 12 security touch points that you should do in every phase of your software development lifecycle. It's 90 pages, opensam.org. It's an open source document. Use it to your advantage. Show your boss, show your organizations. Use it to do audits. It's very, very good. In the end, it's our job. And it's not just the security guy's job, it's the developers, it's the QA, it's the tech managers, it's all the people associated with the information of your company as well as the creation and the production of that software. Hackers have more time than us. They don't need any money because they steal everything, right? And they are constantly trying to find ways to attack us. So we need to think like an attacker. We need to be as knowledgeable, and we have to make sure that we are looking at our software architecture just like hackers are, because they're looking at the entire overview, not just pieces of it, right? So I'm way over my time, but I appreciate your patience, and hopefully this was informative. That's how you can contact me. You can add me to LinkedIn if you'd like, and I'll be around all day. I really appreciate everybody coming to Hacktivity and to my talk. And wish you have a great day, and I'm very, very excited to meet people and learn about what you're doing in Eastern Europe with whether it's software security or other security. So thank you very much.